5 miles from town, the cold is hunting me. If I sleep, I don't wake. The stagecoach rattles away with my name still in its dust, and the dark steps closer like it has business with me. I plant myself on my trunk the way a soldier plants a flag. Books on one side, breath on the other. The wind tallies my mistakes on my skin. It is 28 degrees and falling. If I close my eyes, the frontier will close over me. Weight restrictions, the driver said, eyes like old nails. He tipped his hat the way a man tips a coffin lid. Someone'll fetch you from Promise Creek. He left me with my life reduced to 3 pieces of leather and a promise my mother made me swear. Never trade your mind for a man. The trouble is, out here the cold doesn't listen to women or men. It listens to minutes. I count them in my fingers until my fingers stop telling the truth. The road is a pale ribbon in the moonlight, the sage a black sea on either side. Philadelphia felt like a library that hummed. Wyoming feels like an ear held to God's chest and hearing nothing back. My breath turns to silver threads and vanishes. Pride says, stay with your books. Survival says, walk without them. I hear my father's voice, you'll be ruined out there, and my mother's, gentler and sharper both. Courage is learned like letters. One stroke, then the next. I do not know which voice saves a girl at 28 degrees when the horizon refuses to move. A sound, not wind, intent. The sage parts 30 yards off, and my spine goes cold where the wool cloak can't reach. I stand because fear makes a body honest. A shape lifts its head, antlers catching moon. A buck. It flickers through the brush like a thought I cannot hold and is gone. My laugh comes out cracked and young. I sit again, and the trunk seems to rise under me, a ship in a winter sea with no port. Then another sound. Wheels, slow, deliberate. A harness jingles once, like a coin tossed to fate. I force my numb hands to flatten my skirt so they look like hands and not claws. A wagon rolls into view, moonlight on polished metal. A rifle rests across the driver's knees, easy as a cat. His brim hides his face. Ma'am, a voice says, low and even, Wyoming in it. You all right? I try to be a woman who belongs to herself. I am Violet James, I say, and my teeth knock the name into pieces. I'm the teacher for Promise Creek. He climbs down, boots whispering on frost, and something in the way he moves edges the fear back. He doesn't hurry. Men who hurry make other people run. He doesn't leer. He takes in the road, the sage, the prince, the sky, the way a man reads a problem and shows his work. You been here long? 3 hours, I say. Maybe 4. Time lost its numbers. He shrugs out of a sheepskin coat, heavy as a small mercy, and sets it across my shoulders like he's putting a roof on a house. Heat shocks me. I want to cry because my skin remembers how to be skin again. The coat smells of smoke and pine and some clean animal thing. The stranger's coat smells of smoke and pine. For the first time tonight, I believe I might live. What in God's name are you doing out here alone? He asks, not unkindly. The stage was overweight. They left me with my belongings. Said someone would come. I stare past him so I don't have to see the pity. That was Hutchkins then, he says like a verdict. He'll answer for it. His eyes come back to mine. Can you stand? I can, I say, and my body decides to audition for liar. The world tilts. He catches me with a competence that feels like a prayer fulfilled by muscle. His hands are work rough, careful anyway. Name's Caleb Irvine, he says, like a promise and a fact, and looks past me at the trunk. That yours? All that I am that fits in leather, I say. Primers and readers, my mother's cameo, lesson plans. I can't leave them. We won't, he says. No sigh, no lecture, just agreement. But we're not sleeping on this road. He lifts me as if it's a thing he's done before, lifting what might die unless he does. I am not a small woman, but in his arms I'm brief. He sets me on the wagon bench, tucks the sheepskin tighter, then returns for my life. He tries the trunk. It fights him. He tries again. It slides, then yields. He stows it like cargo that matters. 2 smaller cases follow, and each thud into place sounds like a chapter not being torn out. He glances back down the moon road, the rifle a dark line across the bench between us. Wolves take an interest in quiet things, he says, almost to himself. So do men who ought to know better. His gaze cuts the sage in segments. My heart rests its back against his confidence like a door against a beam. When he climbs up beside me, the wagon dips and steadies. The horses, stocky, winter-ready, shift as if the earth twitched under them. He takes the reins with a hand that knows the difference between pull and guide. "Cold's dropping," he says. "We make town quick. You'll have all your toes come morning." The coat is so warm, I can feel where I end again. I look at him in the margin of my eye. He's younger than the night made him, older than the light will confess. Moon carves his profile into a man who has read the same sky since boyhood. I want to ask him everything: how to hitch a team in wind that cuts, how to learn the weather's grammar, why men like Hutchkins get to decide which women get to be warm and which get to be brave. But my jaw is busy turning into stone. "Keep talking," he says. "Talking keeps you awake." "What about?" My voice shakes less, because heat is an argument the body likes to lose. "Anything. Tell me what's worth saving in that trunk." "My mother's books," I say, and the word mother softens and hurts in the same breath. A cameo, chalk, a slate, 3 dresses that wish they were coats. The rest is paper and hope. "Paper and hope carry farther than most freight," he says, and it lands like he means it. The wagon creaks into motion. The ruts catch, release. Sage brushes our boots like the hands of a crowd I can't see. A coyote lifts its voice somewhere left of courage. The moon keeps its distance. I watch my breath turn to small ghosts and drift away. He tilts his head, studying the west. The air has that empty, glittering sound snow makes right before it arrives to erase the day. "Do you always carry a rifle on your lap?" I ask, because awake is life and questions are awake. "Only when I'm fond of staying alive," he says. "I prefer to be the second surprise in any conversation." He pauses. "You did right staying put. Walk, you'd have lost the road and yourself both." "Staying felt like dying with better posture," I say, and he huffs a sound that could be a laugh. We crest a small rise. Down in the bowl of the land, I see a scatter of oil lamp stars. Promise Creek. Not much to a man from a city, but to me it's the first sentence of a book I've waited my whole life to start. My body tips toward sleep, like a glass on a slanted shelf. "Don't," he says gently. A gloved knuckle taps the bench between us. "Tell me a verse you like." "Emerson," I say, and I hear my mother's voice in mine. "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string." He nods like he's heard that wisdom from fence wire and winter both. "Good line. Hold to it now." I hold. I make myself a teacher again, even without a classroom. I list the alphabet under my breath, then the children I haven't met yet, then the ways I will keep them warm with numbers. The coat is the only reason my teeth can idle at all. The wagon stones toward town like a made decision. "Why did you stop?" I ask finally, softer than the wheels. "Men ride past trouble every day and call it weather." "I don't like graves made of other people's choices," he says, "and I don't much care for the stage line thinking a woman's worth is less than a crate's." He flicks a look at me. "Also, you look like someone who keeps promises. The world needs more of those." The lamps of Promise Creek lift and lower as the land ripples under us. I imagine a bed that isn't frost, soup that isn't air, 4 walls that hold light. I imagine tomorrow, a crooked bell, a smoky stove, children with bad spelling and bright eyes. The coat tightens as if it has opinions. "You're safe now," he says, and then the valley breathes out, the wind rises from its crouch, and a gray wall spills over the ridge, swallowing the town lights whole. A stranger carries me into light. A town decides if I belong. The door gives under Agnes Peterson's practical hand, and the instant the lamplight breaks across the threshold, the heat rises like a living thing to meet us, pricking my numbed fingers back to sensation with a pain so sharp it feels like punishment and forgiveness at once, while the room resolves into the honest clutter of a working house. Tin kettle breathing on the stove, mended quilt draped like a flag of survival over the settee, boot tray lined with snow-wet leather. And Agnes, who is not young and not fragile and not fooled by much, lifts the lamp higher to read my face, as if it were a page that might decide whether her town is civilized enough to welcome a stranger or small enough to turn her away. She has the quick, measuring eyes of a woman who chooses where mercy is spent and expects a return on the investment in plain, decent behavior. She sits me close to the stove with the authority of someone who has chased cold out of more rooms than I have ever sat in, and while steam smudges the window panes and the iron pops as it settles, she presses a mug into my stiff hands, not asking whether I take sugar or milk because the question tonight is not my taste but my temperature, and the coffee blooms through me with a heat that carries shame on its back, since it is one thing to be brave on a moonlit road and quite another to accept charity with grace when pride would rather freeze. So I begin the small arithmetic of survival, tallying the coins I can spend on lodging against the debt I owe to dignity, telling myself that payment made promptly is not vanity, but boundary, that a woman who intends to teach other people's children must first prove she knows the difference between gratitude and obligation. He stands like a shadow at the edge of all that brightness, the brim of his hat still beaded with melted frost, and when I fumble toward the pocket hidden in my skirt, shaping an apology with my mouth and the offer of what I imagine is the usual rate for rescue with my fingers, he answers with a brief shake of the head that feels less like refusal than correction, a wordless lesson in how neighborliness is supposed to work out here. Then he sets the sheepskin from my shoulders over the chair back, as if he means to retrieve it later, and, having confirmed that my trunk and cases have been carried inside and stacked neatly like the cargo of a small, determined ship, he tips the hat in a gesture too clean to be empty and vanishes into the frost-scented dark before my tongue can catch up with the need to ask another question, leaving behind the smell of smoke and pine and the peculiar steadiness of a man who has done the right thing without expecting his name to be stitched to it. Upstairs, where the boards creak like honest witnesses and the room is barely large enough to contain my arrival, I lift the hasp and open the trunk that has ridden under harsher skies than my father ever believed I could endure, laying out my life in careful layers, 3 dresses that will have to pretend to be 5, stockings darned with tidy pride, a shawl my aunt pressed into my hands with the quiet pressure of a benediction, 16 books whose spines show the wear of years of wanting to learn more than was offered, slates and chalk wrapped against the damp, a small bottle of ink that feels riskier than a pistol in a town where a spill would ruin the weak, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief that still holds my mother's soap and lavender ghost, the cameo brooch that is not wealth by any banker's measure, but is collateral against despair. I set it on the washstand where the light can touch it, and, hearing my mother's voice as precisely as if she were standing to my left, correcting a posture or a verb, I renew the promise I made when fever took her. My mind will earn my living, and no man's comfort will be bought with my silence. The Reverend arrives before noon, with a soft knock and a gust of cold, tall and careful in the way of men who spend their lives stepping around other people's grief, and he offers me his arm for the short walk to the schoolhouse, which looks from the road like a small white certainty with a crooked bell that leans as if listening for a better year. Inside, the light falls in patient rectangles across scuffed floorboards. 20 desks in various states of apology confer among themselves about how best to accommodate backs that have outgrown childhood too soon. A blackboard leans toward gray like a memory. The maps wrinkle at the edges as if they understand wind and fingers both, and the pot-bellied stove, tilted with a kind of obstinate dignity and sullen as a child at chores, breathes smoke into the room whenever the door is encouraged. So I learn the first rule of this place, which is that warmth is not a given, but a thing to be argued for with tinder and attention. And while the Reverend speaks of hours and expectations, and the school board's thin purse, his tone carries more welcome than warning, which is the best he can give me, and perhaps more than I deserve, after arriving like a cautionary tale in a town that reads its winters strictly. On the walk back, snow frets at the hem of the afternoon. The street a corridor of faces that study me with that frontier calculus which weighs gossip against necessity, and when Agnes tucks me into a corner of the common room with a plate that smells like childhood done properly. Bread that proves something can rise in this altitude. Stew that tells a story of animals that did their duty twice, once in the field and once at the table. I let the quiet settle not as silence but as truce. And later, upstairs again with the door shut on the good noise of other people's lives, I face the small mirror whose silvering has begun to surrender at the edges and practice what I mean to be to this town, shaping the words with breath that fogs the glass, as if my future could be written there and wiped away if I choose poorly, saying, in a voice that I want the youngest child to trust and the oldest skeptic to respect, "Good morning, I'm Miss James, your teacher," trying the syllables on my tongue until the last one, teacher, sounds less like aspiration and more like fact, then setting my shoulders the way my mother taught me when she said posture informs courage, and repeating again, not for the mirror this time but for the girl inside it who refuses to be a charity case, no matter how warm the coffee was, that I will earn my place here with chalk dust and patience, and whatever grace I can gather without begging for it. I see the school through my window and whisper, "Make me equal to this place," because anything less would shame the brooch and the books, and the woman who sent me west with a mind sharpened for hard work. And although the window is cold and my breath prints fade quickly, the sentence holds inside me like a small stove that knows how to draw clean when tended by steady hands. The hours contract toward 2 o'clock the way winter afternoons do when light is something you pay for with attention. And as I smooth the skirt that will have to work for authority as well as warmth, Agnes knots a ribbon at my collar with the brisk tenderness of a woman who has watched girls become themselves by increments and knows when to tighten and when to forgive, telling me without saying it that a town like this will welcome usefulness more quickly than perfection. Then I follow the Reverend down the short corridor of packed snow toward a door behind which 3 men will weigh my fate against their budget and their son's behavior. And I remind myself with every step that I do not teach to be liked, but to be of service. Although it would be easier for all of us if both could be true at once. At the threshold, the latch catches. The hinges complain a little. The men look up, and in the long, careful instant before anyone remembers how to smile, I understand that their mouths will say welcome because manners are free, while their eyes will ask whether a girl from Philadelphia understands that out here a teacher is not a decoration, but a kind of first responder with chalk instead of morphine. And as the clock on the wall slides its second hand into place with a click that sounds exactly like a verdict, I step forward and give them my name before they can decide to shorten it. At 2 p.m., the school board waits. Their eyes don't match their welcome. I open the school door and meet every reason to run. The key turns with a reluctant scrape that sounds exactly like a frontier morning clearing its throat, and when I shoulder the door inward, the cold slides past my skirts and up my spine like a bold stray cat that believes everything inside belongs to it. So I set my satchel on the teacher's desk that wobbles as if it also doubts my authority, and before chalk ever touches the board, I speak to the empty room, the way a person speaks to land that might feed them if they learn its language, telling the air and the stove and the crooked bell that in this house we will have respect before lessons, work before complaint, and absolutely no cruelty because out here the wind and the miles already take their share of blood and there is no reason for us to help them. The first children arrive with faces scrubbed and eyes that have already seen more of consequence than many men in Philadelphia ever did. Boots clotted with the morning's frost, shoulders squared in that way, small bodies learn when the world has no spare softness, and I greet each one as if I have been waiting for them specifically. Because I have, cataloging hat sizes and nerves and the particular way hope tries to hide behind swagger. Luke Patterson slides in with a loose-hipped insolence that would be charming if it weren't so obviously the armor of a boy who had to start being a man too soon. And he looks me over with a smirk that lands like a dare tossed onto a saloon floor, asking without speaking whether a woman who smells faintly of ink and eastern rain has any business standing between him and the rest of his life. So instead of answering with the lecture my pride wants to give, I write a problem the size of his attention across the board. Not a simple sum, but a small engine of a question that requires the sort of thinking a ranch hand uses to count cattle in a snow squall, and I step back as if I have thrown a rope and now wish to see if the loop holds, while he slouches, then straightens, then begins to reckon aloud because numbers don't care if a boy's voice cracks. They care if he respects the sequence. Around us, 17 children take their seats with the careful thunder of boots that cannot whisper, and when I ask for silence, they offer me the honest version of it, the kind that still includes the stove's complaint and the wind's argument under the sill. And we begin, not because I am a miracle worker, but because I am stubborn, and I told the room how it would be, and the room is listening. Emma, all of 5 and fierce as a lit match cupped in 2 small hands, cannot write her name, and looks at the chalk the way a foal looks at its first fence, unsure which part is obstacle and which part is invitation. So I kneel so our eyes are level, and I show her how the letters live in the air before they live on the slate, drawing them with my finger on the warm skin of her palm, letting the strokes tickle her into laughter so her fear has to leave to make room for breath. And beside her, Samuel, who has spent the first half hour pretending to be slow because he has learned that standing out is a thing that can cost, reveals in one unguarded answer that he understands, numbers like other boys understand horses. Instinctively and with a quiet joy he does not trust, so I hand him a problem that will stretch without breaking him, and pretend not to notice how his shoulders rise with pride, even as his eyes stay down. Because sometimes the kindest respect is to honor the disguise until the wearer decides to set it aside. The stove smokes like it has a grudge against literacy, and every third sentence I speak bends around a cough, tears leaking from the corners of eyes already stung by cold and ambition, and I learn by failure and fingertip how to coax the draft to cooperate, opening the damper the width of 1 penny, then 2, banking the fire with a patience I have mostly reserved for men who mistake politeness for surrender. And while soot threads the air like a bad thought, we keep reading. We keep scratching letters onto slate. We keep turning the human noise of a room full of children into a sound that resembles learning, which is to say, a sound that contains both error and progress in roughly equal measure. At noon, when the children scatter like starlings toward whatever lunches await them, biscuits and jerky and apples that taste like October held on as long as it could, a woman with wind-burned cheeks and bread still warm under a clean cloth steps into the doorway and says my name the way people test ice, cautious and hopeful. And she sets the loaf on my desk with a look that refuses to call it charity, even as it refuses to let me pretend I do not need help, telling me without flourish that the bread is too much for 3 at her house and not enough for 4, so it is exactly enough for me today. And I accept it with the sort of gratitude that does not curtsy, tearing a heel while the room is empty, and closing my eyes on the heat and the yeast, and the sudden outrageous memory of my mother's kitchen. The afternoon stretches long and stubborn. A piece of leather we must work until it softens, and I move from desk to desk, adjusting grips on slate pencils. Translating a geography map into the contours of the valley the children ride every Sunday, folding grammar into the sentences they speak at supper so they begin to recognize the architecture of their own lives, while Luke circles the problem I set him like a cautious rider, assessing a skittish gelding, too proud to quit and too smart to pretend the task is beneath him, and just when I begin to think I have misjudged his appetite, he brings me a slate smudged with effort and graphite. The answer correct, because he refused to let it be otherwise, and without looking me in the eye he drops it on the desk with a grunt that might be considered acknowledgement in some languages, and returns to his seat before the younger boys can translate it into weakness. Luke hands in work he swore he wouldn't. I do not smile until he is gone, because a victory that cost a boy his only armor is not kindness, while a victory he thinks he stole from me may yet become pride he can wear without shame. By the time the bell's rope burns my palm for dismissal, I am hoarse in a way that feels like I have been shouting at the wind all day, and half the word tomorrow is sand as it leaves my mouth, Yet the children file past with faces altered by the smallest degrees, the set of a jaw softened, the tilt of a chin raised, the eyes of a girl who can now write the first letter of her name shining as if a door she didn't know existed has opened a crack. And I lean both hands on the wobbling desk and laugh once. Not at them and not at myself, but at the audacity of believing this might work. Then I gather the papers the room somehow multiplied while my back was turned, a wild confetti of exercises and attempts, and I step into the bruised blue afternoon where the wind has decided to practice being a river. The gust takes my stack as if it has been lying in wait, throws problems and penmanship into the street and the sage in the sky, and I stumble after them with the undignified impatience of a woman who does not intend to see the day's labor trampled by boots or cattle. Outside, boot steps cross the drifted dust, and when I look up, Caleb is already moving through the whirlwind of my papers with the same unhurried competence he used on the road, his hat pushed back, his expression unreadable as he plucks a child's crooked alphabet from a thorn bush and holds it like something that matters. The town's barn glows. If I dance, the rumors begin. The morning starts with coffee that tastes like courage disguised as bitterness, Agnes pouring with the brisk authority of a woman who has turned this boarding house into the sort of port where storm-tossed vessels come to mend, and while steam slicks the window and the bread knives clean because she knows how to keep a blade true, she delivers the news that is not quite news in a tone that says she is not asking whether I am ready, but informing me I already am. Telling me that the church social tonight will swallow me whole if I let it and carry me if I remember to lift my feet in time, that there will be a fiddle that limps a little on the high notes, and a barn that smells like summer stored in wood, and that if I choose to dance with the man who carried me out of the cold, it will save everyone the trouble of pretending they haven't already decided to fix our names together in their conversations like a quilt pattern they have always liked. I smile into my cup because I am not as shocked by the speed of small-town algebra as a Philadelphia girl is supposed to be, and I tell Agnes I will go because the only way to belong is to be seen doing it, and I accept the ribbon she ties at my collar like a charm against pettiness rather than weather. By afternoon the school has coughed itself into sullen acceptance of its own imperfections, and so have I, and when the door opens on a draft that carries with it the clean smell of outside and a man's careful tread, I do not have to look up to know who it is, yet I do because a life can change in the small courtesy of eye contact, and there he stands with a stack of slim, worn volumes bound in a brown that is neither handsome nor ashamed, saying without throat-clearing that his hands, Pete and Tommy, never learned to read the way they ought, that he has been teaching them as best he can using labels and calendars and cattle counts, that progress has been slow because the day steals hours wholesale out here, and men, who fix fences until sundown, don't always find room in their bones for vowels after supper. And would I, if I have spares, lend primers of the sort that do not try to humiliate grown men for being new at something? I do not hide the way my chest lifts, because teaching adults to read is a kind of frontier in itself, and I have wanted to cross it since I watched my mother put words into the hands of women who had been told they needed none. So I set aside the lesson plans and pull from my satchel 3 books that have waited on me to find the right owners, and he receives them with the kind of quiet that says he understands. These are not simply bound paper, but tools that can change how a man sees his own name. Evening leans softly over Promise Creek, and the barn glows like a lantern set under the ribs of the valley, with the Hendersons' long tables loaded in that miraculous frontier arithmetic where everyone brings too little, and it adds up to plenty. And when I step inside on Agnes's arm, the hum of voices pauses in the way a room inhales around a new note, then resumes with a slight, pleased adjustment as if the melody has found its key. And before I can decide whether to stand at the edge and pretend to observe as a scholar or plunge into the middle and risk the slapstick of my own awkwardness, Caleb appears with that particular unshowy attention that makes other men move aside without thinking they've ceded ground, offering a hand that is not an order and not a question exactly, but an opening. And I take it because I am tired of being only brave in private. The real humbles me almost immediately, my steps insisting on city symmetry while the music calls for something more like river logic. Yet each mistake earns laughter that contains no teeth, and by the second turn my body has learned to listen to the fiddle's version of instruction, while his palm at my back says, without squeezing, that falling is permitted, and getting up is expected. And I discover that joy, like competence, can be practiced until it resembles grace. Of course, there is a woman with gold hair arranged the way certain flowers pretend they woke like that, Sarah Connors, whose sweetness is of the sort that sticks to the teeth, and she approaches with congratulations plated like canapes, telling me how very brave I am to leave culture for cattle, how very necessary to teach these poor children who have never seen a museum, how very noble to give up all that refinement in order to do God's work where God clearly forgot to instruct the wind. And I smile because wit would only harden her, and work is the one language everyone in this barn respects. So I say simply that my students are clever and loud and hungry in the right ways, that the stove and I are learning to like each other through applied diplomacy, that numbers matter as much in a pasture as in a counting house, and that if she wishes to volunteer to read to the littlest ones, I will have a place for her every Tuesday after chores. She withdraws, not scalded but surprised, and somewhere behind me Agnes snorts into her handkerchief in a manner she will later deny. We step out for air, because the heat of so many bodies believing in the same moment has its own weather, and on the porch the stars burn with that western ferocity that refuses to be background, pricking holes in the dark until the sky seems stitched to our breath. And he says the word courage, as if he has tested it in the mouth and found it less bitter than expected, while I say maybe because I have learned not to sign my name to futures I haven't read the last page of. And in the quiet that follows, the music drifts out like a promise that does not demand much beyond showing up with both hands and a willingness to let joy count as necessary labor. He notices, without prompting, that the school stove coughs like a chronic smoker, and that the bell's rope chews the skin, offers to send a man who can make metal mind, and he does it not as the price of his company, but as the plain arithmetic of town life where skills are the coin and attention is the tip. We walk back through the barn's glow, and the evening folds around us the way a decent quilt ignores a person's worst edges, and I watch as he returns the borrowed primers to a safer pocket near his heart, as if he intends to guard them against spurs and weather and the casual theft of hours, and I accept a cup of lemonade that has clearly met a little whiskey when no one was looking. And I think about how stories change shape in rooms like this, rumors spooling faster than thread, because gossip is the only currency that never runs out. And yet I find that my fear of being talked about has thinned the way ice does under honest sun, not because the town has grown kinder, but because I have grown more certain that I came here to be useful, and that function is a better armor than charm. When the lanterns hiss, and the fiddler looks like his arm will sleep all night from the elbow down, we drift toward the door with the rest, boots and skirts and a soft-tongued chorus of goodnights that sound like belonging reheated and served again, and on the packed dirt step where the light falls short and the dark does its best work, we pause in the kind of hush that is not awkward but expectant, and he sets his hat a little back as if he intends to make room for a truth. "I'll send Pete to fix it," he says, meaning the stove and also the problem of my shivering children, and then, with a steadiness that suggests he has rehearsed simplicity because flourishes are for men with less to do, "and if you'll let me, I'd like to see you again." On horseback for the first time, I realize falling isn't my worst fear. Settling is. Rosie blinks at me from the stall with the long-suffering calm of a creature who has taught half a county to keep their seat, and when Caleb lays the blanket and then the saddle across her back, he narrates, each strap and buckle as if he is reading aloud from a book I can understand if I don't panic, his hands fluent and unhurried, his voice choosing words that don't make me feel small for what I don't yet know. He shows me how to stand where hooves won't find me if she startles, how to gather reins without strangling the conversation, how to swing my leg like I mean it, and not like I'm asking permission from the sky. And when I finally settle on leather that feels too high and a world too alive under me, he steps back only far enough that I have to trust my own balance, while still knowing he can catch me if physics votes me off. The first steps lurch and sway, and I think about the long list of things I could break out here that hospitals can't fix. And then the motion begins to teach. My hips learning the quiet grammar that says, move with, not against. My breath remembering that fear and oxygen can share a body if I insist. And Rosie's ears flick toward the sound of my voice when I tell her she is a saint, which is the kind of flattery even a horse deserves. We leave the yard through a gate that groans like an old friend, and follow a trail that is less a path than a truce with sage and slope. And the morning lays itself open with that extravagant clarity only this country seems to believe is polite. The sky rinsed to a new coin, the air holding the faint metallic taste of the season changing its mind under our noses. Caleb keeps us at a walk until my shoulders forget to brace for catastrophe, then shows me how to ask for a little more with a squeeze and not a yank, how to talk to the horse through my seat and not just my hands, how to look where I want to go as if vision itself were a command the body obeys. Rosie carries me like she forgives beginners, while his gelding, Red, moves with that rangy competence of something born to make distance feel like a reasonable request. And when we crest the low-rise, the land unrolls a valley the color of coins and old honey, aspens shaking their small golden flags so intently, it seems they might take flight if a breeze tells them a better story is available downhill. In the shelter of that bowl, the wind goes from knife to needle, sharp but not murderous, and we let the horses pick their footing while we tell pieces of ourselves without polishing the hurt to showroom shine, because the aspens make a sound like rain remembered, and everything honest comes easier in that music. I say what it was to hold my mother's hand and name the herbs that eased nothing but made us feel less useless, and how the house after her felt like a schoolroom with the bell suspended, and how my father's love came braided with fear so tightly he mistook the rope for duty and used it to tie me to a future that might have been safe, but would never have been mine. He answers with the small inventory of losses ranchers carry like spare tools, calves found too late, a fence line eaten by weather in a single night, parents buried 6 months apart because some people cannot remember how to draw breath when the other stops. And he draws a map of the boy he was who wanted to be good more than he wanted to be admired, and the man he is who chooses right work over easy comfort not because he is a saint but because the land has a way of punishing men who lie. At the edge of the aspens, a creek braids itself over stones polished by patience, and we dismount onto a boulder that seems designed by God for small reckonings, sun-warmed and flat enough to hold truths without them rolling off. And I say what I have practiced in mirrors and in the privacy of my own stern heart, that I crossed a continent to teach and will not hang up my mind with my wedding bonnet, that I will not be owned by a vow or made ornamental by affection no matter how tender the hand offering it, that if I marry at all it will be to someone who understands my classroom is not a hobby but a homestead with children for crops and books for fences and a stove that must be kept fed if any of us are to survive the winter. He listens without defending men I haven't accused, then lays down his side of the bargain with a simplicity that sounds like strength and not like marketing, saying partnership or nothing, that he will never ask me to shrink to fit his house, that he wants my work alive and loud and occasionally inconvenient, because the kind of life he intends to build requires 2 minds, not one echo. He says he cannot give me ballroom floors or afternoons where a dress stays clean from breakfast to supper, but he can give me a kitchen table where my papers will never be treated as clutter, a bookshelf that will multiply as fast as I do, and a valley where our names can mean useful. We shake on honesty like it is a contract written on skin instead of paper, and the relief that comes with speaking plain is so large it leaves room for something lighter to move in, laughter loosening what fear clenched, a long exhale that tastes like cedar and relief. We are careful with the word love, not because it isn't in the room, but because we both know it is a kind of currency that inflates if spent too quickly. Yet when he takes my hand with those hands that have pulled calves and corrected wheels and set fence posts true, and he lifts my knuckles to his mouth in that old-fashioned gesture that has seen too much foolishness to be silly, the kiss lands not like theater but like a signature. And I understand that whatever we are calling this today, we have already agreed to write its story together line by line. He kisses my knuckles like a contract I helped write. And the part of me that has always demanded a fair wage for my talent finally believes I am negotiating with someone who speaks my language. The horses crop the edge of the creek with that patient obliviousness animals give to human revelations. And somewhere far off a hawk cuts lazy circles into the blue to prove to mice that fate can be graceful, and when the wind shifts the way a room changes when a stranger steps in. He pauses in mid-sentence and turns his face slightly as if scent were another alphabet he reads better than most men spell their names, the bright edge of the day dulling half a shade, in a way I wouldn't have registered if his shoulders hadn't taken on a certain readiness he doesn't know how to hide. He says the weather is adjusting its story and we should head back by the ridgeline because the north has decided to send a message. And as we mount up, he looks at the horizon in the specific way a man does who intends to keep promises and people both from being snowed into silence. Far off, a hawk wheels. And closer the wind turns north with a cold grammar that makes the aspens stop laughing. He breathes once, tastes the change, and says he smells snow. Emma whispers, "My brother might die." The room goes colder than November. Morning enters the schoolhouse like a guest who has heard bad news and doesn't want to be the one to deliver it. The light thin and apologetic and the stove in a mood that promises argument, and we have just begun to coax the alphabet into behaving when Emma arrives late with her bonnet poorly tied and her cheeks raw, and the way she stands in the doorway tells me before her mouth does that the day has an assignment none of us were ready to take. She slips to my desk with the solemn bravery small bodies manufacture when adults' silence frightens them more than thunder, and when I bend to hear her the whisper hits my ear like a stone in a still pond, a shock that radiates outward through ribs and resolve alike. Her baby brother can't catch his breath, the doctor is too far, her mother's hands are sore with worry, and she doesn't know whether prayers are supposed to be shouted or whispered when God lives this far from town. I do not say the platitudes I myself cannot stand, because I have put my ear to a chest that would not rise again, and I know the weight of helplessness. So I gather the children not into desks, but into a loose circle of boots and skirts and stiff collars. And we make the kind of quiet you build on purpose, my voice walking them through words as simple as hunger and as complicated as mercy. Then we fold in the tiny medicine my mother taught me to know when doctors were stories rather than men who knocked on doors. Warmth at the feet, steam for lungs, onions and mustard where air is stubborn, honey for courage if there is any to be spared. Because praying should never be the only verb in a sentence when a child's breath is the noun. After the amen, the room stays in that held breath state where even chalk seems rude, and I send the older boys to the woodpile for extra kindling and set the littler ones, copying numbers they have already learned, because familiar work can contain panic the way a cast contains a break, and in the first lull Agnes appears at the door the way a practical angel would, shaking snow from her shawl and bringing with her the kind of authority that makes rooms exhale. She listens while I say the child's name and the shape of the trouble, and then she performs the small frontier sacrament of telling the truth without cruelty, saying that out here knowledge saves or buries, and sometimes the difference is a mother's memory, that the town will bring broth and blankets and the older girls to hold Emma tight when she pretends she doesn't need it, but that we must also plan for the next family before the next storm acts like it invented sorrow. Her words plant themselves like fence posts along a thought I have carried since my first night at this desk, and while the children copy and the stove experiments with good behavior, I draw a crooked diagram that looks exactly like hope does when it is new, shelves along the back wall for a lending collection no one has to be ashamed to borrow from, pamphlets on fever, and first remedies sitting shoulder to shoulder with primers and readers, a ledger that tracks not who owes me, but who owes themselves the chance not to repeat a preventable loss. Because if I can keep one more child's lungs moving long enough for spring, then teaching spelling will feel less like arrogance in a county that buries babies in winter. Caleb's boots are the punctuation the day uses to change subject, and when he steps into the doorway the weather comes with him in the set of his jaw and the fast blink he can't quite stop, and the words he offers are not melodrama but forecast. The kind of warning men who read sky for a living deliver in time for other people to stack wood and fill buckets and move animals into the logic of barns. He says the pressure is falling like a quarrel that no one will win. The wind has turned vindictive, and the kind of snow that erases fences is on its way by sundown if it keeps its pace. So he has told the Hendersons to look to their roof, and Mrs. Wilson to her flue, and he is telling me now so I can claim the narrow hours left before the world becomes a white room with no doors. We do not make a show of panic because children climb into adult fear the way they climb trees. If we provide the footholds, they will not know how to get down. So I set the noon dismissal at 11 and call it prudence. I send notes home in the hands of boys who will run faster because a mission is better than a warning. I tuck Emma's scarf under her chin myself and make her promise to tell her mother about steam and mustard and watching lips and the miracle of warmth when breath is stingy. And then I ring the crooked bell harder than usual so the sound will carry to the mothers who measure their day by it. When the last child is claimed and the last slate wiped and my own papers gathered into a stack that feels as clumsy as a newborn calf, I lock the schoolhouse door against the storm not because it will keep weather out, but because I need to tell myself there are boundaries, and I lean my shoulder into the wind that has decided to practice persuasion on my spine, and the walk to the boarding house becomes the kind of progress you measure by breath and not by distance. Each block a negotiation between dignity and physics while the sky tries on its gray and finds it fits like a grudge. By the time the signboard creaks above Agnes's porch, the first pellets sting the exposed skin at my wrists with the mean intelligence of thrown salt, and I clatter inside with my papers hugging my chest like a shield, and my lungs igniting at the sudden shift from blade cold to hearth warm, the room expanding around me as if it intends to make space for every fear I have brought home along with the arithmetic. The first snow pellets sting like thrown salt, and I am still shaking the pain out of my hands when someone pounds our door with the stubborn urgency of a man who believes knocking can keep people alive. Agnes reaches it before I do, because she moves toward trouble as if it were a child who needs collecting, and the wind tries to come inside when she opens to it, throwing its weight down the hall with a whistle that makes the lamp flare in protest. The figure on the threshold is so white with blown ice he looks carved out of the storm itself, hat rim iced to a sharpness that could cut a sleeve, coat so stiff with frozen breath it might shatter if he shrugged, and the voice that says, "My name is Horse," with a day spent talking to weather louder than men. Caleb steps inside on legs that have carried more errands than any sane person should attempt between breakfast and a blizzard, and when the door is shoved back against its frame, the world outside becomes a rumor again, while he becomes a man shaking so hard the bones in his wrists seem to want out, and we strip the coat and the gloves and the scarf with the care you give clothing that has become part of the body, steam rushing off him like penance while Agnes orders coffee to be more than coffee and blankets to be more than wool. He looks at me through lashes seeded with ice and manages a crooked half-smile that is apology and reassurance, and the ordinary tenderness of a person who prioritized other people's roofs and stoves and breath over his own. And though my lecture about foolishness rises to the back of my tongue, gratitude gets there first because I know in my bones what white blindness will do to a rider who chooses the wrong fence line at dusk, and the room tilts a degree toward mercy. Caleb stumbles in, ice to the bone and breath a ragged saw, and I understand from the way his eyes keep finding mine through the steam that he has come through the white blindness, not only to warn a town, but to make sure I am counted. When a town disappears, truth has to speak up, Agnes barks, orders the way a seasoned captain does when a wave stands taller than the mast, blankets to the fire, coffee thick enough to argue back, boots off before toes decide frostbite would be tidier. And between the two of us, we peel Caleb out of the storm like rescuers working a man loose from wreckage, the coat so rigid with ice it clinks as it folds, the scarf fused to his jaw in a frost-stiff knot we ease with steam, the gloves a second skin we roll back finger by finger until the hands inside rediscover the trick of being hands. We rub life into him with rough towels and fur-scented heat, counting color as it returns in reluctant shades, gray to chalk to the faintest berry at the knuckles, marking each blush as if it were a mile closer to home. And when the shivering finally shifts from violent to useful, he gets one breath long enough to tell me where he's been, and why I shouldn't call him a fool, even though my heart plans to do it anyway. He speaks as a man who has kept a ledger all day and is turning it in for audit. The Hendersons' roof tarped and waited against a wind that meant to lift it like a lid, Mrs. Wilson's woodbox filled to the lip, and a path cut to her door so she wouldn't have to choose between breath and snow, a detour to the line shack where young Billy had barricaded himself with bravado and wet matches. Then the long blind run for town when the weather quit pretending to be merely inconvenient. He does not call any of it heroism, because in this county there are no medals, only the private arithmetic of doing what daylight requires before daylight ends. Yet when his eyes find mine through steam and lamplight, I hear the unsaid line. And then I came to be sure you were counted, and I want to be angry at him for turning himself to ice on my behalf, even as gratitude unties the knot at the base of my throat that has been cinched since noon. Night lifts the boarding house onto a dark sea and sets it adrift, every window a porthole where snow slaps and skirls and stamps its feet, the hallways tightening into passageways, the common room becoming a galley where Agnes ladles stew into bowls with the calm of a woman who can feed fear until it forgets its appetite. People who were strangers yesterday cluster now like kin around the stove that finally learned to draw clean, Mr. Harrison producing a deck of cards whose corners remember other storms, Mrs. Henderson knitting like a metronome set to sanity, Billy trying not to stare at Caleb in the embarrassed awe of a boy who has seen a man he respects choose difficulty over comfort all afternoon, and into that soup of breath and worry I pour the one thing that has always steadied my mother's house and mine. The sound of a story read aloud until the wind remembers it is not the only thing with a voice. I choose a chapter with rivers and hard choices, and the kind of courage that pays cash rather than credit, and as my voice lengthens and settles, the room does too, the children drawing closer without meaning to, the men listening with the unblinking attention of horses who know the difference between thunder and a wagon on a far road, the women letting their shoulders drop the smallest degree because for the width of a paragraph they are not entirely responsible for everyone else's heat. The gusts fling their fists at the windows and get nowhere. The stovepipe hums like a tuned wire. Caleb's eyes close not in sleep, but in the kind of relief that happens when a man who has been reading weather for 12 hours allows someone else's words to carry his weight for 12 minutes. Somewhere between a battle on the river and a dawn no one thought they would see, I realized that if roles were reversed, if he were the one inside and I the one watching the horizon for a sign of a friend, I would have saddled a horse in this howling white and ridden toward his door, because the arithmetic of my fear has been updated by the presence of this man, and the answer to whether I dare is no longer about reputation, but about whether I can live with myself if I do not try. We let the cards and the reading and the knitting run their courses until it is properly late for a storm to still be screaming, then properly later when it finds its breath and screams again, and when Agnes finally declares a curfew on worry and orders us to bed like unruly cousins at a funeral. I walk Caleb to the spare room at the end of the hall because it seems important not to have our last look at one another be across a crowd. The lamplight throws his shadow against the wall in the shape of a man who has not yet learned how to step back from responsibility, and he thanks me for the reading in a voice roughened by cold and river and not enough rest, and I say the thing I have been resisting because I am tired of leaving truth to chance. You haven't asked for anything, I tell him, the words wobbling only once before they steady. And I am done with men who expect gratitude to become tether. If you mean to court me, do it as a man who believes in what my work is and must remain. I will not be made small to fit inside anybody's house. His face does the particular softening I have seen on tough men when somebody finally speaks the sentence they have been carrying in their pockets all year, and he answers without adornment that if there is to be a we at all, it will be built like a good corral. Square, honest, with gates that swing both directions and fences that hold without cutting, because he has no use for a wife who is an echo when what this place needs is another voice. He says partnership as if it were a thing he has been saving against a hard winter, and my body, which has been a citizen of my mind's republic since before I buried my mother, recognizes the rare luxury of believing a man's vow, not because it flatters me, but because it fits what I have seen him do when no one was watching. The storm hush after midnight. Our future sounds louder than the wind ever did. We part with a promise intentionally smaller than a kiss, so no one in a nearby room can misinterpret it or cheapen it with a smile at breakfast, and I lie awake in a bed that creaks like it learned the language of storms in another house, staring at a window turned to blank chalk by the weather, and I say yes in the privacy where a person's real oaths are made. Yes to courtship that honors the ledger of my days. Yes to a man who rode through white blindness to count me, and would have respected me in the morning if I had refused him anyway. When I sleep, it is the thin kind children do on the night before school begins, full of sharpened pencils and large maps, and the hope that the bell will ring before the fear does. Morning arrives like a truce, the silence shocking after the night's argument, and the town is transformed into a geography of white dunes and sudden canyons, the front steps drifted to the height of a man's hip, the street a level page with all its lines erased. Men convene with shovels the way soldiers meet muster, women inventory pantries with the ruthlessness of quartermasters. Children bounce in place because even grief takes its time to hurry through a house. Word travels faster than any horse in this weather because sorrow uses its own roads. The Miller baby did not live through the second night, the pneumonia having taken what breath winter left, and the sentence drops into the common room with the finality of a stone into a well. The splash swallowed before it can be seen, and we all look down as if we could watch it sink and somehow pull it to the surface again if we were fast enough. Morning brings quiet, and word that the Miller baby did not survive. My father's ink says I am no longer his daughter. The envelope is the color of money and authority. The hand on it a script that taught me how to loop a G with pride, and how to dread the sound of my name when spoken in a certain tone. And Agnes places it beside my plate with the care of a nurse, setting down a bitter draught, meant to cure, or at least to prove that trying was attempted. I break the seal, because I am brave when paper is involved, and because I know cowardice breeds in sealed rooms, and the words unfurl with the cool efficiency of a banker's ledger. You have disgraced the name that fed you. You have chosen ignorance over society. You have broken with the future arranged for you. And if you persist in this outrageous course, I shall consider you no child of mine. And though I have been rehearsing for this particular wound since the day I bought my ticket west, the cut still surprises with its depth. Not because I expected kindness, but because habit makes the body lean toward the familiar even when the familiar is a fist. Agnes reads my face the way weather readers do the edge of a cloud bank and calls it what it is without frosting. Cruelty, not discipline, a tantrum disguised as patriarchal wisdom. And the word lands like a snow shovel hitting a buried stone, honest and rough and exactly necessary, but I cannot stop myself from answering in the only language I truly speak, which is analysis. I call it familiar, because there is a relief in being confirmed as the thing I prepared for, the worst my father could be becoming merely the thing he has been in stages, and I feel the strange steadiness that follows a diagnosis. Still sick, but named, which is the first step toward living with it. She pours coffee that remembers last night's storm and adds a spoon of sugar without asking, because compassion is often practical, then sits across from me with both elbows on the table, and tells me in the frank tone women use when they are done trying to impress one another that family is who keeps you warm and fed and held to your best standard, not who signs the checks, and that while a father who writes you out of his household is a loss that deserves tears, a daughter who writes herself out of a life that would have starved her is a gain that deserves a celebration. Caleb arrives as a man does who has spent the morning measuring the town's endurance and found it acceptable for now, and when he sees the letter he does not start in on promises to fix what he cannot, does not offer to teach my father respect between fence posts, does not even touch my hand until I have finished listing aloud the old injuries. This new insult simply puts in ink. He reframes where my mind has fogged, saying that power is often the loudest synonym for fear, that I must not hand my future to a man who has already told me he won't see it. That permission is a currency I do not need in this county, and never really needed in Philadelphia either, except to keep peace at a table where a woman's hunger was thought indecent. He reminds me that we have already drawn up the contract that governs us, partnership or nothing, so there is no clause under which his pride will ever take payment from my silence. And for the second time in as many days, the knot at the base of my throat loosens because someone has translated my ache into sentences my courage can parse. I write back steady because paper deserves better than theatrics, and because women's arguments are always held to a standard, men's are not. I choose words that respect the part of my father that loved me before he confused possession with protection. I decline to apologize for the happiness growing in this rough soil, and I make it plain that while his blessing would be welcome, his permission is unnecessary and will not be missed. Then I fold the letter with the same care I bring to closing a book I intend to reread someday without flinching. When the storm paths are broken and the town begins to walk rather than wade, the news we have been carrying quietly between our ribs meets daylight because secrets turn sour if kept too long in rooms that have seen sorrow, and we tell the people who have fed us and fixed our stove and lent us sons and bread that we intend to braid our names, not because we crave applause, but because consent given in public is a wall that weather cannot knock flat. The engagement becomes the town's property immediately, in the way good news does here, mothers crying with the relief of a story that ends in warmth, men clasping Caleb's shoulder with the particular fierceness of approval between the practical and the tender, children looking at me as if their teacher had become a character in a book worth finishing. I touch my mother's brooch and feel the old oath hum under my skin. I am still her student, even now, making promises she would recognize and not once call foolish. The one conversation I dreaded approaches me on small, determined feet in a pale dress and a gloved smile. Sarah Connors, who has had reason for 2 winters to suppose that a certain rancher might eventually make her life more interesting, offers congratulations, salted with the faint bitterness any sensible woman would taste in such a moment. And yet when we step aside into a corner where lantern light catches the decent angles of her face, she surprises me by bowing out with a grace I did not expect, telling me that she hopes I will be very happy, that she can see I make him steadier rather than smaller, that men who respect women's work are rare enough to be protected, and that she will not be the one to spoil that by pretending this match is anything but correct. I thank her not with tactics, but with sincerity, because I know how much it costs to behave beautifully when you are disappointed, and in that small corridor of candor, we make a temporary treaty on behalf of all the girls who will come after us and need examples of how to lose without becoming less. Evenings swell with a new timbre once the news has legs, conversation at Agnes's table turning from weather and wood to practicalities that will build a day worthy of the word vow. Who can bake? Who can borrow chairs from the bank's basement? Which hymn fits a church that learned to host funerals before it ever mastered weddings? While Caleb and I keep returning to the single clause that will govern everything after the cake is eaten, that my classroom does not close because I married a man with cattle, that his ranch does not suffer because he married a woman with chalk, that our house will be a place where children learn to read at the kitchen table and where a ledger lives peacefully beside a stack of primers. We speak our arrangements aloud enough times that they cease to sound like demands and begin to sound like architecture. And every time my resolve wavers under the ghost weight of my father's expectations, I lay my hand against the cameo at my throat and let the cool oval remind me that love is not the price of my mind, but the partner of it. Caleb, who has learned the art of simple declarations and the power they hold over storms internal and external, chooses an evening when the sky has finally remembered how to be ordinary again, and the street smells like wood smoke and thaw to name the date not as a trap, but as a promise with room in it. He says, May 15th, with the calm certainty of a man calling the weather correctly 3 days out, and the corner of his mouth lifts at my raised brow, because he knows I will test any calendar against the school's needs, the valley's chores, and the time grief requires to walk through the Miller house and leave it quiet enough for a hymn. May 15th, Caleb says. If you still want me then. I do. And I will. No one gives me away. I walk because I choose. The morning opens like a page I have been saving, the light rinsed clean by a polite breeze, the church whitewashed to honesty rather than spectacle. And when Agnes fastens the last tiny hook at my collar, she smooths the dress the way a gardener pats new earth, satisfied because this gown was stitched by the same hands that fed me through winter, pieced by women who taught me how to turn scarcity into beauty and gossip into alliance, its hem carrying the neat arithmetic of a town that believes in what it can make for itself. The mirror shows a woman whose hair holds wildflowers instead of jewels, whose brooch, my mother's cameo, rests like a seal on the treaty I signed the day I left Philadelphia, and when the first bell lifts in the clear air, I do not wait for a man to offer an arm because ceremony will not rewrite my principles, so I take the aisle with my head high and my steps steady, not surrendered or bestowed, but self-delivered to a future I argued for and won. Faces rise like lamps as I pass, the congregation a field of familiar weathered kindness, and at the front Caleb stands in the new suit he insisted on only because he wanted to honor the day with more than clean sleeves, his collar a little too stiff for a neck used to wind, his eyes so unguarded they nearly undo me. Reverend Collins opens his book, and I open the folded paper I wrote by lamplight after grading sums that refuse to cooperate, and when my turn comes, I read aloud what I have practiced in quiet vows that name the work before the romance and the partnership before the poetry, sentences built like fences, square, visible, meant to keep in what matters and keep out what wounds, promising equal yokes and shared weather, promising to measure love not in grand gestures that wilt by morning, but in the daily stubbornness of showing up with both hands. Caleb answers with words he has hammered into shape the way a man trues a wheel, plain language that refuses to hide behind flourish, promising to protect my work from loneliness, to keep a chair cleared for my students' papers even on branding day, to treat the lending library ledger like ranch inventory, to meet grief with labor and joy with gratitude, and when we exchange rings, simple bands of gold that shine with the modest confidence of fence wire, they settle on our fingers, with a weight that is more comfort than burden, the metal warm from the pocket he carried it in all morning like a small son he was smuggling into the room. The amens arrive without fuss, and then with applause that startles the swallows in the eaves, and the barn, dressed in lanterns that give the rafters their own constellations, becomes a sea where music does the steering, tables groaning under pies set down by hands that have never let a neighbor go hungry, children whirling as if they could invent new physics with their boots, old men telling stories that grow taller under praise, and in the middle of all that decency, Pete, coat-brushed, hair tamed with an effort that makes Agnes smile into her hand, climbs onto a crate and reads a speech he has written in the careful letters my primers taught him, his voice shaking only once when he says that the boss fixed fences and cattle, but the teacher fixed him, that learning to read his daughter's letter without help was the first time in 50 years he felt taller than his hat, and the room goes quiet in the way it does when everyone recognizes a holy thing that has nothing to do with stained glass. I cry the kind of tears that polish rather than blur, and Caleb takes my hand under the table so that the gratitude has somewhere to go. And when the fiddler finds a reel, we learned the night roomers first tried to write our story for us. We dance it without tripping because practice is a kind of prayer, then slip out through the door when the lanterns grow throatier and the stars begin their patient work. The wagon is dressed in ribbons some child has tied badly and beautifully, red stamps as if he understands ceremony, and the ride home is a soft thunder of hooves and breath, and the sort of silence married people keep when they are discovering how many words can sit comfortably on a single bench. At the porch, Caleb hops down and turns toward me with that particular mischief that belongs to men who know tradition is useful when it honors rather than erases, and he lifts me with a strength that feels like promise made visible, carrying me across the threshold I helped build, because 2 weeks ago I stood in this room with a measuring string and a list, and he never once asked whether shelves would make the house less his, Lamps glow along the walls in a welcome I did not dare imagine when I was counting stars on a frozen road. And the kitchen holds the faint scent of cinnamon and soap, like two friendly arguments agreeing to share the sink. Bookshelves line an entire wall, not a token stack but a long, generous spine of wood, space he made for me without being asked, dusted and waiting with a patience that understands many of the best children in this county, will begin here as borrowers long before the board finds money for new texts. He shows me the desk he built by the east window, where morning lands first, the drawer with a secret sliding tray for ink when toddlers arrive and believe they are painters, the peg for my shawl by the door because he has watched me shiver one time too many while I search beneath papers for warmth, the rocking chair made of cottonwood that will sit beside the fire we both intend to feed at day's end, with the offcuts of our pride. Upstairs, the room holds more shelves. Space for my dresses, yes, but also space for the stacks of drafts and registers and essay cards that accumulate in a life where knowledge is counted and recounted like winter hay. And there is a small box on the dresser I did not notice, until he opens it to reveal a ribbon he found under my trunk the night I arrived and kept, because he liked that I arrived in pieces and still held shape. We light the final lamp together because superstition is simply gratitude spoken in chores, and we stand in the middle of our own floorboards, all the work of other people's hands holding us up, the Hensons for the barn, Pete and Tommy for the windows, Agnes for every small stitch between neighbors, and Caleb looks at me the way a man does when he is about to speak a line he intends to live and not merely repeat, his voice more rasp than bass from a day spent thanking everyone twice, and he says the two words that made me weep by a boarding house fire when they were only a future. "Welcome home," he says, and the room answers back in my own voice. "If knowledge is warmth, I will keep this whole valley fed." We start with lumber planed smooth enough to invite touch and labels written in my neatest hand. And by the end of June, the school's back wall has become a small republic where paper is the only passport. A lending library arranged the way a pantry is. Soups beside stews beside jars of summer saved for winter. Primers set shoulder to shoulder with histories. Recipes adjacent to remedies. A thin row of songs for nights when the wind requires accompaniment. I write rules in the plainest words I own. No shame in borrowing, only in hiding need. Clean hands and clean intentions. Return what you take so someone after you can take it again. And the books, which have waited years to prove themselves better than hoarded treasure, begin their circuit, riding out to ranch kitchens in pie baskets, slipping into saddlebags beside fence pliers, standing on nightstands like lanterns that have learned the trick of not smoking the ceiling. Primers pass from Pete's rough fingers to Tommy's patient ones, and then on to the bunkhouse, where a circle forms under a lamp that stutters but does not quit. And I answer questions that arrive with the dawn rolled up in scrap paper. What sound does this letter make when it sits beside that one? Why does the past tense of a life feel heavier than the present? Can a man who is 50 learn to sign his name in a way his grandchildren will be proud to watch? Some evenings I collect the books back again and they smell like cattle and coffee and cedar shavings, and I think how lucky language is to be this useful. Caleb's pride in all of it is quiet but relentless, a steady provision of small infrastructure. Shelves added the way drought adds worry lines, time carved out of tasks that already fight for hours, a stack of pencils purchased from a catalog with coin that could have bought a new cinch because he has done the arithmetic and decided literacy makes the whole herd smarter. Summer brings 3 young women with trunks that carry more resolve than clothing, and the boarding house becomes a campus by accident. Agnes presiding with the satisfaction of a dean who charges tuition and chores, while I turn the common room into a laboratory where lesson plans are built and taken apart and built again, where a single slate becomes a blackboard because ambition is contagious, where theory is not allowed to leave the table until it has been fed examples. We walk to the school every morning in the eager heat, and I show them how a roll call can be a diagnostic and not just an inventory, how a stove is a co-teacher and must be managed with as much grace as a 12-year-old with folding arms, How a reading circle is a firebreak against despair when winter comes for the small and the sick, and at night we sit with tea that has met a little whiskey, and we write letters to their future classrooms, asking forgiveness in advance for the mistakes they will make in the first month, which is how good teachers are born, penitent, persistent, ready to try again at 8 the next morning. Luke Patterson, who smirked at me on the first day and then smudged a slate with stubborn intelligence until he had to respect himself, becomes my ally when the room grows raucous, shouldering the kind of leadership that doesn't swagger and therefore sticks, and he astonishes himself by reading out loud to the littlest ones in a voice he used to save for horses. Margaret Hayes blooms under attention that isn't charity, her mind a quick meadow that only needed water, and one afternoon she lingers to ask the question that wrote itself in her eyes weeks ago. What path does a girl take from this one room to the kind of teaching that changes rooms across a map? And I pull out a sheet and draw a route that has no guarantees but many mile markers. A season with me to apprentice. A winter of correspondence lessons sent from Cheyenne by a woman who knows how to mentor at a distance. A spring spent practicing the art of standing still while 30 bodies move around you and 30 souls test you for holes. And when she nods, I see another shelf filling in the library we're building, the one that stores people instead of paper. Not all days are civil. In late autumn, the Carlson place flares orange at midnight, a stovepipe betrayal. And by morning only black bones stand where walls kept out January. Yet before the ash cools, the town has already started its choreography, men hauling lumber with the ferocity they usually save for blizzards, women setting up stoves in borrowed kitchens so children will not learn hunger along with loss, boys ferrying water and nails, girls minding babies in circles that look like forts. And I turn the school into headquarters without asking the board for permission, because emergencies answer to competence, not to minutes. We keep a ledger of who has what so shame never finds traction. And when Caleb shoulders a beam into place with Pete and Tommy and half the valley, he does it with the same quiet joy he carries to a well-told story, because building is a language we speak together fluently now. A plaque will not come for years. No one is thinking about accolades when there are fences to mend and children to teach. Yet I already see it on our wall in my mind. Not for vanity, but because I want the next girl who arrives with a trunk full of paper to know we measured this life and found it worthy. Autumn slides its cool hand over the valley, and the library's ledger fattens with names that used to appear only on church rosters and ranch payroll, now written with the confidence of people who expect to be asked what they think. Caleb adds another short shelf near the floor because he noticed toddlers squatting like colts to choose books, and he drills a pegboard along my desk so slates and rulers can live in plain sight instead of galloping off under benches at recess. And he buys, with no announcement, a small tin of blue-black ink that refuses to freeze even when the stove sulks, because he knows winter will arrive with its usual policies, and we intend to resist them with sentences. On the angrier days, I teach through a voice rubbed down to velvet by use, and I come home to find another brace on a wobbly chair or a new hook where a coat used to slip to the floor, the house learning as quickly as I do how to hold. Agnes drops by with recipes for feeding hungry readers and a rumor that the territorial board is watching, not with suspicion, but with something like admiration tempered by distance, while the trainees, now back at their own desks, send letters that crackle with first victories and first defeats, and I answer each one with the truth that saved me. You will never be done learning how to teach, so you will never be bored. The days grow short, and the mornings try on frost the way a girl tries ribbons, unsure which suits her temper. And I wake before the bell with a peculiar swim to my stomach that I chalk up to nerves until it returns the next day and the next, persistent as a child at the hem of a dress. I eat toast by the kitchen window watching steam lift from the creek like the valley thinking out loud, and Caleb kisses my temple with a distracted tenderness, because his head is already in cattle and weather and posts that lean, and I tell myself the ache will pass, because there is too much to do to entertain ailments. I feel sick at dawn for the third day, and when Agnes presses a cool hand to my wrist, she does not call it a fever. I taught breath and letters, now I must teach myself to survive birth. The plan begins, as all frontier plans do, with a ledger of what we have and what we can only pray will arrive in time. Agnes laying out clean linens that have known boiling water and lie and purpose. Sarah folding them with the practiced tenderness of a woman who has caught more children than she has counted storms. A kettle set to sing before it is needed. A lamp trimmed. The bed dragged closer to the hearth because heat is a midwife's oldest partner. And the doctor, useful, respected, miles of winter and drift and wish away, placed carefully on the shelf labeled impossible unless God insists. So we nod our courage instead to women and water, and the stubborn way a body remembers the instructions handed down, mother to daughter to neighbor, like a recipe that saves more than meals. Through the restless weeks before the hour chooses me, I keep teaching as if the bell itself were a contract with my former self, standing at the board with a belly that has turned my center of gravity into a new geography, laughing when chalk dust lands on a child's nose and pretending not to notice when the room leans toward me in a protective hush I did not ask for, and I argue with my guilt, like it is an old aunt who will not stop fussing, explaining to her that sense must win because a woman cannot spend the next 40 years apologizing to a ghost of duty, when there is a living child who will require the grammar of her mother's breath. The day it starts, the sky is that particular polished blue that lies, the kind that makes you believe nothing difficult is coming when in truth it has already saddled up, and the first pain is almost courteous, a tightening that reminds me of a stitch from running too far with a book bag on my shoulder, so I ignore it because pride is a poor student. Then the second arrives with a better memory, and the third with a clock in its hand, and by noon I am holding the door jamb in one palm and my future in the other, agreeing to sit and then to lie and then to rise and walk, because bodies and babies both prefer movement to complaint. Agnes times without looking at the clock, listening instead to my breath and the way my voice shortens its syllables, and Sarah rubs my lower back in a circle that has soothed a dozen women, and will probably soothe a dozen more, while the stove performs like a prodigy, throwing heat without smoke as if it understands that failure today will land it in the yard tomorrow. And in the hall I hear Caleb carve a furrow in the floor with his pacing, wearing his worry into the wood because there is nowhere else to put it, and when he is allowed in for 1 minute of his own mercy he kneels. A big man folded small, and his face is a map where fear and tenderness are trying to share a river. Labor stretches the clock thin until the numbers show their skeletons, hours flattening into a long road of breath counted in 4s and 5s, and sometimes 7s when I bargain. And the world shrinks to the size of a bed and a washcloth, and a woman's voice naming me brave when I feel neither brave nor woman, only animal and fire, and the echo of my mother's hand on my hair, telling me in memory voice that the body knows a door it carved, that the mind must open with it, or the hinges will scream. There is a point where I mislay my name, a point where I swear at God with the kind of intimacy that only birth and grief allow, a point where I command the world to stop turning because I would like to step off and then step back on at a more convenient hour, and then because all storms end, not by being convinced but by running out of weather. The night tears like old cloth, and the room fills with that particular cry that is both protest and promise and proof that a new citizen has registered with air. They place her on my chest, and the weight is a miracle heavier than the sum of ounces, a heat that climbs into my bones and makes a home like it has been renting space there for months, and I name her aloud because names are spells that anchor us to our story. Elizabeth, for the woman who taught me that a mind is a dowry no man can squander. Margaret, for the aunt who posted love like a lantern in the window when my father turned out the lights, and she blinks at me with eyes that will choose their shade later, but are already interested, already fierce, already arranging the room to her satisfaction, while Agnes laughs a sound that belongs on summer porches, and Sarah ties off the work with the calm of a captain who has brought another ship safe to harbor. Caleb returns as if someone opened his chest and replaced the engine with a bird, his hands trembling around shoulders that have roped calves and carried roof beams, and now cannot seem to settle on where to rest. And when he touches our daughter, he does it with reverence and terror and a farmer's gratitude for rain. Days reorder themselves as if someone took my lesson plans and wrote over them in a bold new hand. Our hours now broken into a syllabus of feedings and changes and the 2 a.m. seminar in endurance. The house teaching us that partnership is not theory, but a schedule. Caleb rising in the dark to walk the floor with a small tyrant held like a prayer. Me learning the latch and letdown of milk with the humility of a beginner at a blackboard, both of us mastering the grammar of us, which turns out to be present tense punctuated by tender profanities and the occasional exclamation of wonder at how a fist the size of a walnut can command 2 grown adults as efficiently as a bell. The town pours itself into the shape of our need, the way a river finds a new bank after a flood. Agnes arriving with soups that taste like comfort baked into stock. Sarah bringing a bundle of hand-me-downs that hold the ghosts of other babies who have graduated to boots. Mrs. Henderson presenting a cap so small it looks like a joke, until it makes our daughter's head look more like a thought than a fruit, and the boys from the school chopping wood in a competition that neither wins because I refuse to declare ties. One afternoon, Pete stands on our porch with hands scrubbed raw and a paper folded to the size of bravery, and he clears his throat and reads his daughter's letter aloud. The words traveling across the miles and years to land in this room because I helped place them in his hands. And when he wipes his eyes, he calls me teacher, like it is a title granted by a higher authority than any board. Even in the honeyed fog of newness, the tug begins, part-time at school calling like a bell I cannot unhear. Not because I am restless with my child, but because the classroom is also a child I have kept alive with stubbornness and warmth, and a refusal to let the door blow open in January. I balance Elizabeth on my shoulder and pace the room we built with vows, counting in my head the hours I can borrow from sleep and community, without turning usefulness into martyrdom. And I whisper promises to both of my callings that I will not let one starve to feed the other, that love is not a zero-sum arithmetic, if the adults in the room honor their own limits as fiercely as they honor their duties, that I will be 2 kinds of mother if I build a structure that lets me sit in 2 chairs without tearing the seam of my life. Part-time at school calls to me, can I be 2 kinds of mother at once? My father knocks. The house decides what kind of man he still is. He stands on the porch in a coat that learned its manners in Philadelphia, and its humility somewhere between Cheyenne and here, hat in hand the way a boy holds a truth he cannot disguise, and the wind lifts a strand of his gray hair like it has a right to rearrange him, and for one suspended breath I am 15 again, and then I am the woman who built this threshold and invited no ghosts to join me on it. So I open the door and let the room judge us both, because houses do that. They remember the kind of voices that have filled them and decide what echoes they are willing to tolerate. He meets his granddaughter first because that is the only order that will work, Elizabeth launching her whole self at the novelty of him the way toddlers audition the world, and he takes her with an astonishment that looks almost like prayer, saying in a voice I have not heard since my mother's last summer that the child has Elizabeth's eyes, the same shape, the same mischief at the corners, and when he hands her back he keeps his hands out a moment longer as if they are surprised to be empty again. The apology arrives without mastery, but with the effort that proves it was paid for, sentences that do not always find the right words but reach toward them like a man wading across a river that is deeper in the middle. And he tells me that grief turned his love into a locked room and that pride nailed the door shut, and that reading my letter made him see he had been guarding an empty house while the people he loved pitched tents somewhere kinder. He does not ask me to pretend the ink that cut me wasn't sharp, and he does not ask to be forgiven on a schedule that flatters his timetable, and because humility is rarer than wheat out here and twice as nourishing when you finally taste it, I say yes to a slow repair, a long road with benches, the kind where we agree to sit when we are winded rather than striding past our own limits. Life refuses to pause the other stories, so this one can have the stage, and the week he visits is also the week Margaret Hayes receives a letter with a seal that makes her hand shake, telling her that if she wishes, a 1-room school 40 miles north will belong to her mind, and her keys come spring. She runs to me with the paper as if I am the only one who can translate it even though the sentences are plain, and we stand in the doorway of my classroom with our foreheads touching, while I tell her that the map is real and the road is narrow and the destination is worth every blister. The trainees I taught last summer scatter like lanterns across the territory, their letters arriving in envelopes smudged with weather and resolve, stories of stoves that learned obedience, and boys who discovered ink could also plow, of girls who stopped apologizing for knowing answers men didn't. And I answer each one with praise and a reminder that fatigue is not failure. It is proof that work is being done where it matters. When the board decides to honor me, it is not with a purse or a medal, but with a handsome wooden plaque that smells faintly of varnish and gratitude, the words carved deep enough to outlast a generation of winters, naming me for what I already knew and needed to hear in public anyway. A teacher who made a town read itself into a better story. I hang it near the desk Caleb built, because that is where it belongs, not over the mantel where strangers might admire it without understanding, but beside the place where I keep registers and letters and the small box of notes students leave that say, "Thank you for seeing me," in the awkward handwriting of people who have just learned their names deserve space. Our porch holds our laughter in the evenings, like a cistern keeps the rain, catching jokes and stories and the kind of contented silence that happens when a day's work was enough but not too much. Caleb's palm at the small of my back a punctuation mark I have learned to lean into, Elizabeth narrating her empire in a language that already has opinions about mine and more, Pete stopping by on Sundays to report that he has read 3 more pages and did not stumble, Tommy asking if the library might borrow a second copy of The Reader with the train on the cover because the bunkhouse is arguing over whose turn it is. And sometimes my father sits in the second chair with a stiff gratitude that softens by the minute, telling stories of my mother that taste like fruit we thought had gone out of season, and discovering that forgiveness is often a quiet chore finished with a hum rather than a hymn. Elizabeth tugs my skirt at dusk and says, "Mama, book," which is the best command I have ever obeyed, and I scoop her up and we claim the rocking chair that has memorized our shape, her hair smelling like sun, her breath warm against my neck as the first page sighs open. There are still quarrels with weather, and men who imagine tradition is an inheritance that must not be questioned. Still mornings where the stove sulks, and afternoons where the horse decides she has opinions about the creek. Still letters that arrive with news that makes us sit down before we read the second paragraph. Yet the ridge behind the house holds our future as comfortably as a palm holds a coin. The pasture rolling out its steady green grammar each spring, the schoolhouse learning to shoulder more, not less, as the town swells with births and courage, and my marriage continuing to be the kind of classroom where 2 students teach each other the same lesson in new languages until meaning arrives and stays. The day my father leaves to return to the city that shaped his spine and his resistance, he stands on the porch and looks at the sky like it might decide to adopt him if he says the right words, and he touches Elizabeth's hair and calls her a wonder, and he touches my face and calls me teacher and daughter with equal weight, and I walk him to the gate, and we do not promise more than we know we can finish, but we agree to write, and we agree to visit, and we agree that the dead are best honored by the living who do their work with excellence and mercy. That night, when the house has eaten and quieted and the last cup is washed and turned upside down on the towel, when Caleb has banked the fire and the baby's sighs have evened into the rhythm that makes angels jealous, I step onto the porch, and the stars are the same audacious number they were the night I almost slept to death beside a trunk that held my past and my possible. Stars over Wyoming, the same as the night I almost slept to death.